Hello, world history students. Today's lecture, I think, is going to be a little bit more exciting than yesterday's lecture. Yesterday was all about the Great Depression, as you know, and a little bit about Weimar Germany. But today we're really talking about the pre-World War II and then edging into World War II period of time a little bit, talking about European fascism and the fascist empire in Japan. This is Unit 11, Part 2. Once again, all of this is sort of leading us into World War II. First of all, remember that the Great Depression, which starts in 1929 with the crash of the American stock market, spreads to the entire world. In the 1930s, things were really pretty terrible for much of the industrialized world. Factories were closed. Farmers couldn't really find markets to sell their really cheap, sadly, products in, and so on. As the 1930s went on, a number of states, especially the Democratic states, started to spend more money on people and help them out, and they started to recover really by the end of the 1930s from the Great Depression. The early 1930s were really pretty terrible for everybody with a lot of unemployment. Some of the weaker democracies, though, really didn't have a chance to overcome the economic problems and actually change. They turned into different kinds of dictatorships. They really wanted strong leaders who had all of the answers for everything and could get them out of their economic problems. This happens right away, even before the 1930s in Italy. It's kind of an odd thing that happens in Italy that we'll talk about in just a second, but they went to a fascist or a totalitarian state really quite early. The Weimar Republic, too, as you know, had a number of problems with the Treaty of Versailles and not having a lot of German public support for it. It also fails, and you probably know that it also becomes Nazi Germany very quickly in the early 1930s. The leaders of Italy and Weimar Germany both followed the ideals of fascism. You can see the ideals of fascism there on the left-hand side. It is very much like totalitarianism, except that fascism has a much more nationalist or, sort of crazy pride in your own country. It's very militarist. You can see they're political. It's nationalist. Sometimes it's racist, like in Nazism. It is totalitarian in that there's a supreme leader and a one-party rule. Economic functions, where the economy had a lot of government control, not always. I mean, there was certainly a lot of capitalism in Nazi Germany, for example, but in both Nazi Germany and Italy, you had a lot of economic control by the government. Culturally, there's censorship and school indoctrination. There's also a secret police that arrest people in the middle of the night and put them in prisons or in camps. You can see that socially it's supported by middle-class people, generally who feared communism, and industrialists in the military who profit from being controlled by that. So Italy and Germany are the chief examples. Spain, if you're interested in that too, was a fascist state for a while. In Italy, Benito Mussolini is the dictator. They call him the chief or the leader. Il Duce is his nickname. And he founds this fascist party, an extreme nationalist party with pride in Italy and militarism, all the way back in 1919, right after World War I. Really, Italy had won World War I with Britain and France and the United States, but really the Italians didn't feel like they got very much out of the war. They lost a lot of people, territory or anything. And these fascists grew in power by criticizing the government for not getting more out of World War I, for really not being able to run the country effectively. That's kind of a thing that happens in Italy for much of its more modern history. And then also striking fear of a workers' revolution. Remember in 1917, the Bolsheviks had taken over Russia, and after a civil war had the Soviet Union, or a communist state. And a lot of people who weren't working class people or factory workers really didn't want to have a communist state, and so they went with the opposite of communism, which is fascism. Well, Mussolini is able to get into power legally. He promises that he's got all these answers, and the King of Italy appoints him to be the leader. Soon thereafter, he is able to abolish democracy altogether, and he gets rid of all the other political parties. He jails his opponents, and he tries to control the army. the economy. He's trying to control the economy in order to create an army that is going to be able to take over other territories. That's what fascism is all about, really. It's about taking over territories, showing that your country's the best, and being very nationalistic. Meanwhile, in the Weimar Republic, as I've said several times now, the Weimar Republic was really quite weak and unsupported. It's a democracy, and the Germans really hadn't had that before. And then the loss in World War I really, really affects things in Germany. Adolf Hitler is a guy who fought in World War I. He leads this National Socialist Party, that's what he calls it, or the Nazi Party. And one of his big things, besides being fascist, militaristic and nationalistic, is he's got this sort of racial nationalism where he thinks that Germans are a superior race of people to other people. And he really, really hates the Treaty of Versailles because it had weakened Germany, it had humiliated Germany, and he's really quite angry about it. He also thinks he's kind of a crazy guy. He's got a lot of weird ideas, but he also thinks that communism and Judaism, or Jewish people, are sort of behind all the bad things that are happening in the 20th century. And so he wants to get rid of the Treaty of Versailles. He wants to make Germany great again. He vows to restore Germany's lands. They had lost lands in the Treaty of Versailles. Restore Germany's power. They hadn't had a military because of the Treaty of Versailles, and Germany's glory. So he wants to kind of turn the loss in World War I around, have another war that actually is going to be successful for Germany and make Germany supreme again. Citizens in Germany turned to him hoping for security, for something different than the Weimar Republic. They too wanted to overturn the loss in World War I. Not that they were all crazy for war, but they felt pretty humiliated and sad about World War I. And he is offering firm leadership. He's also telling them that communism is a danger, and that he can take care of communism as well. So just like in Italy, you have somebody appointing Hitler to be the ruler in January of 1933, and very quickly, just like in Italy, he is able to establish a dictatorship. He turns Germany into a totalitarian state by taking control of the economy, that is to say, getting the factories back to work, by ordering military goods from them, tanks and planes and guns and ammunition and that kind of stuff. He also strikes fear into people. If people were against the Nazis, they are oftentimes arrested by the secret police. They're imprisoned. You probably have heard of concentration camps. That's where the enemies of the Nazis are concentrated and oftentimes either held or simply killed. And so very successful at getting control of the Germans. He's really forcibly controlling every aspect of German society. Every single organization had to have the words Nazi in front of it, or it didn't exist. So they got rid of a whole bunch of organizations, or turned them into Nazi organizations, so that every single aspect of German society was controlled. Especially the schools, as you can imagine. The schools are teaching Nazism. They're teaching that Hitler is a kind of godlike figure. And then too, the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts are turned into what they call the Hitler Youth, and then the Organization for German Girls. And they teach little kids to be sort of fanatical Nazis. Sadly, part of Hitler's racial theories and racial beliefs is that the Germans were superior, and that the Jews are this evil population, that they're the most evil people in the world, constantly trying to control the world through communism. How he gets that connection, who knows? And so when the Nazis took power, they started to deny rights of Jewish people, started to make them lose their jobs, started to eventually control where they could live, doing things like not allowing them to have radios and ride on public transportation, and eventually they're going to put them in camps, as you know, during World War II. So Nazism is a kind of fascism with a heavily racial element to it as well. And I say that from the Nazi point of view, believing that Jewish people are a separate race. Don't necessarily believe that kind of thing. So aggression begins in the mid-1930s. Italy decided to invade an African state, the African state of Ethiopia. It's kind of like a return to the scramble for Africa in a way. You might remember, too, Ethiopia was one of the two states in Africa that didn't get taken over by European peoples. Well, 1936, Italy invades Ethiopia using poison gas and airplanes and tanks and machine guns. They're able to take over Ethiopia. This makes Mussolini and the Italians kind of happy because they feel like they're being successful after not being so successful in World War One. Hitler, meanwhile, is violating the Treaty of Versailles by rebuilding the German military. And as he's rebuilding the German military, he starts to pick off territories that his military wasn't supposed to be in, like the Rhineland, or even picking off bits and pieces or chunks of entire countries, taking over Austria, south of Germany. If you've seen the movie Sound of Music, that's kind of what that's about. Or there's part of it that is the theme of the movie. There's also a bit of Czechoslovakia that you can see there that is sort of this, I don't know what color that is, mauve. That's called the Sudetenland, and Hitler demanded that the Sudetenland become part of Germany, and Britain and France agreed to that and gave that mauve part of Czechoslovakia to Hitler. Shouldn't have done that. This is what we call appeasement. Appeasement is giving in to people who are, or nations who are demanding something from another. And so in this case, it was the Sudetenland. Hitler gets that. He promises, once he's been appeased with that land, he's going to leave the rest of Czechoslovakia alone, which was a lie. He took the rest of it over really pretty quickly, and Britain and France were really angry about that. And that was basically the last straw. They said, if he tries again, we won't appease him. They appeased him because they wanted to avoid war, but they realized you can't appease him. He's like a hungry wolf. Meanwhile, the United States, after helping Britain and France win World War I, kind of wondered why they got involved in World War I and started to follow a policy of isolationism, or staying separate from everybody else who was doing all kinds of things around the world. They didn't want to mess with Nazi Germany. They didn't want to mess with German aggression and so on. And so the United States is just sort of hanging back and ignoring the rest of the world and trying to deal with the Great Depression by itself. Meanwhile, in Japan in the 1930s, you might remember Japan was this crazy success story from the 1860s on, becoming industrialized and actually becoming an imperialist state. In the 1930s, military leaders took over control of Japan and turned it into a kind of fascist state as well, a hyper-nationalistic state and militaristic state. They invaded Manchuria. You can see it's just north of Korea. You might remember they took Korea or got involved in Korea way back in the early 1900s in a war against Japan. So they invade Manchuria and take it over. Really, the Japanese don't have very many raw materials on the islands that make up Japan, and so they're trying to get raw materials in Manchuria, and then from Manchuria they invade the rest of China. You might remember that in the last unit too. But they invade China, once again trying to take over Chinese people and trying to take over Chinese natural resources as well. They are really very racial minded as well. They believe that the Japanese people are superior in the same way that the Germans believe that they're superior, and they brutalize Chinese people and other Asian people. There is this thing called the Rape of Nanking. Nanking was the capital of China at that point in time, in which Japanese soldiers took over Nanking and literally raped many, many people, and then also killed thousands and thousands of people in the most brutal ways. It's a really terrible thing. I think I'll have you read an article about it next time. During World War II, the Japanese, in search of even more raw materials, are going to extend their control over places like Indonesia, the islands down there that say Netherlands, East Indies, the Philippines that was controlled by the United States, and the South Pacific. And in fact, the reason why Japan invades or bombs Pearl Harbor is to try to sink the American fleet and knock the Americans out of World War II before we could possibly get involved. So the Axis powers, then, those three that we talked about, Italy and Nazi Germany and Japan, decided in 1940 to sign an alliance called the Axis powers. And they did so because they're totalitarian, they're all fascist, they're all militaristic states that wanted war, wanted to take over territory, and believe themselves to be superior to others. So it's going to be the Axis in World War II fighting the Allies, and we'll talk about the beginning of the war later. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Please take the lecture quiz and have a great day.